This is On The Docket, where Hollywood true crime meets the courtroom and I break it all down for you. Almost 30 years have passed since Tupac Shakur was gunned down in Las Vegas. For decades, it felt like the case was going to go unsolved and that nobody would ever be held accountable. The case was wrapped in rumors, conspiracy theories, and silence. And now, nearly 3 decades later, Keefe D is finally going to trial for the murder of Tupac. The big question in this case is whether this is justice at last or is this a case that simply is too cold to win? Before we get into the trial, let's talk about why Tupac still matters to this day. He wasn't just a rapper, he was a force. He spoke for people living through poverty and injustice, but he also wrote about love, family, and resilience. His roots in the Black Panther gave his music this raw mix of poetry and protest. And even though his life ended at the young age of 25, his influence never did. You see it in music, fashion, film, and activism. Hip-hop became a global conversation about race and justice, and Tupac was right at the center of it. Let's rewind to 1996. It's September 7th, Las Vegas. So Tupac and Death Row Records' Suge Knight left the Mike Tyson fight, which was being held at the MGM Grand, and while driving down Flamingo Road, a white Cadillac pulled up alongside their car. Now, the Cadillac rolled down their windows and started shooting into the car with Suge Knight and Tupac. Tupac was shot 4 times and was immediately transferred to the hospital. He then died 6 days later from his injuries, and he was just 25 years old. And of course, this murder made headlines worldwide, and honestly to this day still do. But the investigation quickly fell apart, so witnesses refused to cooperate, evidence was scarce, and police were accused of mishandling the case. The trial eventually went cold, and Tupac's murder joined the long list of America's infamous unsolved crimes. And yet, one man, Keefe D. Davis, also known as Duane Davis, kept talking. In police interviews, in documentaries, and even in his own memoir called Compton Street Legend, he admitted that he was in the Cadillac on that fatal day. He even claimed that his nephew, Orlando Anderson, is the person who fired the actual shots that killed Tupac. So when Keefe D was arrested in 2023, nearly 3 decades later, the shock wasn't about who, it was more like, why did it take so long? Now, to really understand why Tupac's death mattered so much, we need to kind of get into the feud and understand what was going on behind the scenes. So there was a beef between the East Coast and the West Coast. And now this wasn't just any ordinary beef, it was an industry war. And though I was born in the 90s, I truly wish that I was an adult in the 90s so I could have witnessed this industry war going on, because as I deep dived into my research, I just was blown away about the insanity of it all. We truly will never see anything like this in Hollywood today. So on the West, you have Death Row Records, and that's with Suge Knight and Dr. Dre running the empire and Tupac as its star. Then on the East Coast, you have Bad Boy Records. Now that was run by Sean Diddy Combs with the notorious Big IG as its crown jewel. This wasn't just about music. It was a LA versus New York, Compton versus Brooklyn, ego versus ego war. Now I'll just add this, Tupac and Biggie, though on opposite sides of the country, were actually really good friends at one point, but that all changed in 1994 when Tupac was shot 5 times in a New York studio. He survived the shooting, but he accused Diddy and Biggie for setting him up. Now, why does he think that? Apparently, nobody really knew where his location at the time, so he showed up at the hotel, and before he even got into the elevator, he was attacked by these men who ended up shooting him. He did eventually get into the elevator. He took the elevator, rode it up to the studio where Diddy and Biggie were. And according to Tupac, Diddy and Biggie were being very weird. They refused to look into his eye. It was just a very strange circumstance, and his suspicions really grew from that moment. And mind you, even though Tupac and Biggie were good friends at one point, they had just had a falling out over a mutual friend in which Tupac was hanging out with. And that's a whole other deep dive that I can get into if someone's interested. So leave a comment if you are. Now, what also lends to this whole situation of Tupac being shot 5 times is that the next day he actually had to appear in court for a sentencing hearing, because in 1994, Tupac was convicted of first-degree sexual sexual abuse in New York. This case came from an accusation that he and others sexually assaulted a woman in a hotel room. So the very next day after being shot, he appeared in court and he was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. Now, he only served about 9 months before he was released on bail pending appeal. Now, Suge Knight is the reason why he was released. Suge Knight posted the bond and made a deal with Tupac that if he were to post the bond, that Tupac would then sign with Death Row Records. When Suge Knight bailed Tupac out of prison and signed him to Death Row Records, Tupac unleashed the track Like Hit 'Em, which directly targeted Biggie and Bad Boy Records. The media was in a frenzy over this. They poured gasoline on the fire and they framed this as a rap war. Fans took sides, but it wasn't just about rap. It was violence, it was gangs, and it was reputation. So when Tupac was murdered in 1996, many saw it as the tragic climax of this feud. And really, the feud is said to have claimed both Tupac and Biggie because 6 months after Tupac's death, Biggie was shot down in LA. So two of the greatest rappers of all time gone in less than 1 year. Now, back to the present. Keefe D's trial is complicated. Prosecutors don't have a gun, they don't have fingerprints or DNA. What they do have are his own words. Over and over again in different interviews, again, his book, Keefe D placed himself in that Cadillac. That fact is critical because in conspiracy law, you don't have to be the one that actually pulls the trigger. You just have to be a part of the scheme or the plan. The prosecution will likely argue that Keefe D's admissions are enough to prove his involvement. They'll say he played a role in enabling the murder, making him legally responsible. But the defense is most likely going to point to the age of the case. Witnesses are gone, memories have faded, evidence is lost. They'll claim Keefe D was chasing attention or exaggerating stories for money and notoriety. And they'll even point to Keefe D's nephew, Orlando Anderson, who is allegedly the trigger man, who actually died in 1998 without ever facing any criminal charges for this murder. This is bigger than a courtroom. For fans, Tupac's murder has been an open wound for nearly 3 decades. It represents the violence that ended the feud between the East and the West Coast. And it raised questions of, did the justice system fail one of America's most important cultural voices by having this case go so cold? Obviously, even if Keefe D is convicted, it will not bring Tupac back. And if he's acquitted, it doesn't erase what we already know from his own accounts. But this trial definitely is symbolic. It says that Tupac's life mattered enough for justice to finally be pursued, even if it's late. And it also reminds us that his influence still hasn't faded. Nearly 30 years later, the world is still listening. Now, we've covered the murder, the feud, the evidence, and why this trial is bigger than just one man. But this story isn't over. In fact, it's just beginning. Here's where things stand right now. Duane Keefe D has pleaded not guilty to the first-degree murder. His trial is scheduled to begin February 9th, 2026, and it will be held in Las Vegas. The trial will be public, though there might be some pretrial hearings that we will not have access to view. Now, the defense has already filed motions asking for more time, saying they need to interview key witnesses. They are claiming that there are some witnesses that place Davis away from Las Vegas at the time of the shooting and therefore then contradicts Davis's claims that he was in the Cadillac. They've also tried to point fingers at others, including former Death Row Records security head Reggie Wright, who denies any involvement. And prosecutors, meanwhile, are sticking to their case that Keefe D himself confessed repeatedly over the years. And that's what they'll use to tie him to the conspiracy. So what's next? Jury selection, pre-trial rulings on what evidence is admissible, and eventually opening arguments. And as this unfolds, I'll be here on the docket, bringing you every major update from courtroom motions to the trial's closing arguments. But stay tuned. I'll be covering this trial step by step all the way to the verdict. Make sure you've subscribed so you don't miss any of the updates. And let me know in the comments, after nearly 30 years, do you think prosecutors can actually win this case? See you guys next time.